The world knew Eddie Van Halen as a guitar god who revolutionized rock music with seemingly superhuman technique. But what most people didn't know, what even his closest competitors couldn't figure out for over a decade, was that Eddie's most famous instrument was built on a foundation of deliberate deception. The iconic red, white, and black Frankenstrat wasn't just a guitar. It was a carefully engineered trap designed to mislead anyone who tried to copy the legendary brown sound. And for 15 years, it worked perfectly. If you were alive then and heard Eruption blast through your radio for the first time, you remember exactly where you were when those 102 seconds changed rock guitar forever. Eddie Van Halen didn't just play fast. He played in ways that seemed physically impossible. Guitarists around the world immediately started trying to decode his secret. They studied his technique. They watched his hands. They tried to build replicas of his homemade Frankenstrat guitar. But no matter how hard they tried, nobody could recreate that tone. Nobody could capture that raw, violin-like sustain combined with aggressive power that became known as the brown sound. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind rock's greatest legends, hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Eddie Van Halen's genius. The deception started in a small garage in Pasadena, California, where two Dutch immigrant brothers were about to change music history with less than $200 and a willingness to destroy perfectly good equipment. Eddie and Alex Van Halen had grown up feeling like outsiders, first as Indonesian Dutch kids in post-colonial Amsterdam, then as immigrant children in American schools where they were forced to eat lunch in the bathroom to avoid bullies. That sense of being different, of being underestimated, would become the psychological foundation for one of rock's most brilliant cons. Eddie's Frankenstrat was born from necessity and poverty, but it became a weapon of competitive advantage through pure cunning. In 1974, Eddie walked into a music store with a simple goal: build the best guitar possible for the least amount of money. He bought a body seconds, a factory reject ash body with cosmetic flaws, for $50. He added a $70 maple neck. The Gibson PAF humbucker pickup came from a different guitar entirely. The whole project cost him around $130, the price of a used car payment. But here's where Eddie's genius emerged. He didn't just build a cheap guitar that happened to sound great. He built a cheap guitar that looked deliberately confusing, and then he made sure everyone saw it. The famous striped paint job wasn't just aesthetic rebellion. It was camouflage. Eddie took black electrical tape, laid it in random patterns across the white body, then spray-painted everything red. When he peeled off the tape, the result looked chaotic, almost accidental, and that was precisely the point. Every guitarist who studied the Frankenstrat in magazines or from the audience saw a guitar that looked homemade, amateurish, thrown together without plan or precision. They saw a body covered in cigarette burns. They saw components that didn't match. They saw what appeared to be a collection of random parts that somehow, inexplicably, produced divine tone. What they didn't see was the methodical deception Eddie had engineered into every visible component. The most famous example, the one that fooled professional guitar techs and manufacturers for years, was the dummy knobs and switches. Look at any photograph of the Frankenstrat from the late 70s or early 80s, and you'll see what appears to be a standard three-way pickup selector switch mounted prominently on the guitar's face. Eddie made sure this switch was clearly visible during performances, interviews, and photo shoots. Rival guitarists assumed this switch-controlled pickup selection, the way it did on virtually every other electric guitar in existence. They were wrong. That three-way switch did absolutely nothing. It wasn't connected to anything. Eddie had deliberately installed a non-functional switch in the most visible location possible, while the actual pickup selector was hidden elsewhere on the guitar. He did the same thing with tone controls. The visible tone knob that thousands of guitarists tried to replicate in their own builds was disconnected. Eddie had removed it from the circuit entirely because he preferred his tone wide open, without any filtering. But he left the knob in place because he wanted people to think it mattered. He wanted them to waste time adjusting a parameter that didn't exist. Even more devious was what Eddie did with the guitar's visible wiring. During interviews and backstage encounters, Eddie would sometimes let other guitarists examine the Frankenstrat up close. They would see the wiring, trace the connections, try to understand the signal path. But what they were looking at was partially theatrical. Eddie had added extra wires that went nowhere, created false solder points, and generally made the internal electronics look more complex and chaotic than they actually were. When these guitarists went home and tried to recreate what they'd seen, they were building replicas of a deliberately misleading blueprint. But the Frankenstrat deception was only half the story. The real secret to Eddie's tone wasn't in the guitar at all. It was mounted on the wall of his garage, and later his studio, in plain sight, but completely misunderstood. This is where Eddie's technical knowledge separated him from virtually every other guitarist of his era. While his competitors were studying his fingers and his instrument, Eddie was manipulating electrical current in ways that wouldn't become common knowledge for another decade. The device was called a Variac, a variable transformer, typically used in industrial settings to adjust AC voltage. Most household electrical outlets in America deliver 120 volts. Guitar amplifiers are designed to operate at this voltage, and their tone characteristics are engineered around this standard. But Eddie discovered something that most amp designers knew but guitarists didn't. When you reduce the voltage feeding into a tube amplifier, something magical happens to the tone. The power tubes begin to starve. They struggle to amplify the signal efficiently. This struggle creates a phenomenon called voltage sag, where the amplifier compresses the guitar signal in a way that sounds thick, saturated, and incredibly responsive to playing dynamics. Eddie's Variac setup was brilliantly simple and devastatingly effective. He would dial the voltage down to around 89 or 90 volts, roughly 25% below normal operating voltage. His Marshall amplifiers, already modified in various ways, would receive this reduced power and produce the warm, compressed, singing sustain that became the Brown sound. The tone was so distinctive that it became Van Halen's sonic signature. And for years, nobody could figure out how he was doing it. Professional guitarists would show up at Van Halen concerts and recording sessions with expensive equipment, trying to capture something close to Eddie's tone. They bought the same Marshall amplifiers. They experimented with different guitars, different pickups, different speakers. Some of them even built Frankenstrat replicas down to the smallest detail, matching the pickup specifications and bodywood. And they all failed because they were looking at the wrong part of the signal chain. The secret wasn't in the guitar or even in the amplifier itself. It was in the wall voltage feeding the entire system, controlled by an industrial device that most guitarists had never heard of and wouldn't have known how to use if they had. Eddie actively encouraged this confusion. In interviews throughout the late 70s and early 80s, he would talk extensively about his guitar modifications, his pickup choices, his string gauges, and playing technique. He would demonstrate his famous finger tapping, explain his vibrato approach, discuss his use of tremolo effects. All of this information was accurate and helpful. but it was incomplete. Eddie never mentioned the Variac. He never discussed voltage reduction or power tube starvation. When interviewers asked about his amplifier setup, he would talk about speaker modifications and output tubes, steering the conversation away from the input voltage that was actually creating the fundamental character of his tone. This wasn't just competitive secrecy. It was strategic misdirection on a massive scale. Eddie understood something profound about human psychology. When people are given partial information, they assume they have the complete picture. Guitarists heard Eddie explain his technique and equipment. They saw his Frankenstrat up close, and they believed they understood the formula. The fact that they couldn't reproduce the results didn't make them question the information Eddie had given them. It made them question their own abilities. For 15 years, thousands of guitarists around the world assumed they simply weren't talented enough or dedicated enough to sound like Eddie Van Halen. The truth was, they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle that Eddie had deliberately concealed. The deception extended even into the recording studio, where Eddie's methods were protected by professional confidentiality and selective information sharing. When Van Halen recorded their first album at Sunset Sound Studios in 1977, producer Ted Templeman and engineer Don Landy were sworn to secrecy about Eddie's techniques. The official story released to the press was carefully curated. They talked about the guitar. They mentioned the Marshall amplifier. They described Eddie's playing approach. But the complete signal chain, including the voltage manipulation and specific microphone techniques, remained proprietary information. Other producers and engineers who tried to recreate the Van Halen guitar sound found themselves frustrated, unable to capture that specific combination of power and clarity that made Eddie's recorded tone so distinctive. What makes Eddie's deception even more remarkable is that he maintained it while simultaneously being one of the most interviewed and photographed guitarists in rock music. Van Halen became superstars almost immediately after their first album release. Eddie was on magazine covers, doing gear clinics, demonstrating his playing at music trade shows. Every appearance was an opportunity for competitors to study his methods. And every appearance reinforced the false narratives Eddie had constructed. He would play the Frankenstrat with its dummy switches clearly visible. He would discuss his amplifier modifications while carefully avoiding mention of the Variac. He would demonstrate tapping technique while letting people assume that technique alone was responsible for his tone. The psychological brilliance of this approach was that Eddie gave away real information generously while withholding the key elements. This made him seem open and helpful rather than secretive and protective. Guitarists felt like Eddie was sharing his secrets with them. They studied his interviews religiously, practiced his techniques obsessively, and built Frankenstrat replicas lovingly. And none of it got them significantly closer to the Brown sound, because the foundation of that sound was information Eddie simply wasn't sharing. By the mid-'80s, Eddie's competitive advantage was so complete that he had effectively created a musical moat around his signature tone. Other guitarists had developed their own styles and sounds, but nobody could replicate what Eddie was doing, even when some guitarists stumbled onto voltage reduction techniques independently. They didn't understand the specific implementation that Eddie had perfected through years of experimentation. The Variac wasn't just plugged in and set to a random lower voltage. Eddie had calibrated the exact voltage reduction that worked with his specific amplifiers, his specific guitar, and his specific playing dynamics. This calibration was the result of thousands of hours of experimentation, and it wasn't something that could be easily reverse-engineered. The deception began to crack in the early 90s, not because Eddie revealed his secrets, but because guitar technology and information sharing evolved. Guitar magazines started publishing more technical articles about amplifier modification and tone manipulation. Professional techs who had worked with Eddie began sharing information, sometimes inadvertently, about his setup. The internet was emerging as a platform for guitarists to share knowledge and compare notes. Slowly, piece by piece, the guitar community began to assemble a more complete picture of Eddie's methods. But even as information leaked out, Eddie maintained some level of mystery. When asked directly about the Variac in interviews during the 90s, he would confirm its existence but downplay its importance. He would suggest that the Variac was just one small part of a larger equation, which was technically true but strategically misleading. Eddie understood that maintaining some level of mystique was valuable, both for his competitive position and for his legendary status. The moment his tone became completely reproducible by anyone with the right equipment was the moment it lost some of its magic. The complete story of Eddie's deception didn't really emerge until the 2000s, decades after the Frankenstrat had become one of rock's most iconic instruments. By then, Eddie had moved on to signature model guitars manufactured by major companies. The original Frankenstrat had been retired, rebuilt, and modified so many times that it bore little resemblance to the guitar that appeared on Van Halen's first album cover. But the legend remained, and with it, the full truth about how Eddie had fooled the guitar world for 15 years. Looking back, Eddie's strategic deception reveals something profound about innovation and competitive advantage in creative fields. He didn't just invent a new sound. He protected that sound through carefully constructed misdirection that allowed him to maintain a unique position in the market for over a decade. The Frankenstrat's dummy switches and chaotic appearance, combined with Eddie's selective information sharing about his amplifier setup, created a barrier to entry that no amount of practice or dedication could overcome. Competitors weren't trying to catch up to Eddie's technique. They were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces that Eddie had deliberately hidden. This approach stands in stark contrast to the open-source, information-sharing culture that dominates music today. In the modern era, professional guitarists regularly post detailed videos explaining their exact gear setups, signal chains, and playing techniques. The idea of deliberately misleading other musicians about your methods would be considered almost unethical in contemporary guitar culture. But Eddie came from a different era, one shaped by intense competition for record deals, radio play, and touring opportunities. In that environment, maintaining a competitive edge through proprietary techniques wasn't just acceptable, it was survival. The Frankenstrat deception also illuminates Eddie's relationship with his own identity as an innovator. He wasn't content to be merely an excellent guitarist. He wanted to be unreplicable. The dummy switches and hidden Variac weren't just about protecting commercial advantage. They were about maintaining the mystique that separated Eddie Van Halen from every other fast guitarist with good tone. In a world where technical proficiency could be learned and equipment could be purchased, Eddie created value through information asymmetry. He knew things other guitarists didn't know, and that knowledge translated directly into a sound that couldn't be copied, no matter how much time or money competitors invested. There's something almost poetic about the fact that Eddie's greatest deception was hiding in plain sight. The Variac wasn't locked in a vault or disguised as something else. It was mounted on the wall of his studio, visible to anyone who walked in. But because most guitarists didn't know what a Variac was or what it could do to amplifier tone, they literally couldn't see what was right in front of them. Their expectations about where guitar tone came from, the guitar itself, the amplifier, the playing technique, blinded them to the possibility that the secret might be in the electrical infrastructure supporting the entire system. When Eddie Van Halen passed away on October 6, 2020, the tributes poured in from guitarists around the world. They praised his technique, his innovation, his influence on rock music. Many of them shared stories about trying to copy his tone, about building Frankenstrat replicas, about the years they spent chasing the brown sound. Very few of them mentioned the fact that Eddie had deliberately made that pursuit nearly impossible through one of music history's most successful long-term deceptions. But that deception was as much a part of Eddie's genius as his finger-tapping or his songwriting. It showed a level of strategic thinking that went far beyond musical ability. The Frankenstrat, with its dummy switches, now resides in the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History, preserved as a cultural artifact of rock's golden age. Visitors can see the iconic striped paint job, the mismatched components, the worn fretboard that Eddie's fingers traveled across thousands of times. What they can't see, what no amount of preservation can capture, is the invisible deception that made this instrument legendary. The fake switches will never move again. The hidden wiring will never carry signal. But the story of how Eddie Van Halen protected his competitive advantage for 15 years through deliberate misdirection remains one of music history's most fascinating examples of innovation combined with strategic thinking. In the end, Eddie didn't just change how guitarists played. He changed how they thought about the relationship between equipment, technique, and tone. The Frankenstrat deception proved that sometimes the most important innovations aren't the ones everyone can see. Sometimes they're the ones hiding in the wall voltage, in the dummy switches, in the information deliberately left unshared. Eddie Van Halen understood this truth better than almost any musician of his generation, and he used it to create and protect a legacy that remains unreplicated to this day.